welcome everyone today to our first panel. We have Simon joining from Carlsberg and Geraldine joining from Grundfos. But first, I'll just quickly define net zero, because I think it's always useful to start there. So a company that has achieved net zero is a company who has reduced its emissions in line with 1.5 degrees by between 2040 and 2050, and essentially neutralized the remaining emissions. And this is across its entire value chain. So one cannot essentially achieve net zero before 2040, 2050. However, there are, of course, interim targets, short-term targets that companies have typically set to 2030. So today we're going to be discussing that entire journey and what it kind of takes to set those targets and implementation plans. But before we start, we've got a little poll just to see where everyone is on that journey. So as you might be aware, our panelists have set net zero targets and are going to be sharing their experience there. But we really want to hear from the audience as well, where you are at, so we can get a feel of who's in the room and hopefully get some engaging questions as well as we go through the panel. And just a reminder there that, of course, you can put those in the chat and we'll hope to leave some time at the end to get to those. If we don't get to them, we will respond over email. So I hope the poll has worked. I can't see it myself, but maybe if we're not getting any results yet. So maybe as that's coming through, I'll quickly hand over to Simon and Geraldine to introduce themselves, and then we can see the results. Yeah, maybe Simon, you start, and then Geraldine, and then hopefully the results will come through.
Sure. Thank you, Pauline. So my name is Simon Boas Hofmeier. I'm the head of Group Sustainability and ESG at the Carlsberg Group. The Carlsberg Group is a fairly large brewing company. We have many different brands across the world. One of them you can see behind me. It's a Vietnamese brand called Huda, but we also have more known brands for us here in Western Europe, including Tuborg and Carlsberg and other brands. And I look forward to the panel discussion.
Yeah, my name is Geraldine. I'm the climate director in Grundfos. And Grundfos is a pump company in a simple term, but we do also a lot of water solutions. We are based also in Denmark, operating internationally around the world. We have 34 plants around the world and 56 operating in 56 countries and covering around the world. And we have committed to SBTi since 2019. And then last year we have got both our near-term and also our net zero target approved. So look forward to share more with you.
We have two leading companies here today who have set those net zero targets and are really on the route to net zero. So I think it would be really great to hear from you both first how you kind of came to the decision internally to set those targets in the first place. I think a lot of members in the audience are probably still in that phase. And of course, net zero is incredibly ambitious. It's very long term and quite hard to conceptualize because it goes far beyond, the regular business planning cycle. So maybe Geraldine, if you can kick us off with how you kind of developed that internal business case, why Grundfos really felt it should take the lead on this topic.
Yeah, happy to do that. And of course, what we have done, we are looking at food from both the angle of the lens of responsibility, but also on the opportunity. And last but not least, of course, also a little bit on the risk assessment. So responsibility, it is, of course, as you also have the beginning, have said that, the science is very clear that we have to, as a world, we have to heading into net zero. So we cannot really just stop at the near-term target in 2030. So, sorry, as a company, this is really purpose-driven and as Grundfos. And we have even in our vision saying that we will pioneer our solution to solve the world's climate and water challenge and improve the quality of people's life. So that actually gives me a very strong strategy, which is normally really important in a business case, that you have a strategic fit. So that's where our purpose and part of our responsibility. An opportunity, it is actually something that we also explore in the process when we are setting up our near-term target. So in 2019, so going back a little bit history, memory lane now, and when we committed to the near-term target, I think we actually only looking into 2030, what we can do. But the process of doing that open up to see what kind of business opportunity and innovations, and it's also for room for transformation is available there. I think first we see a lot of opportunity, but at the same time we also can see that many of the transformation and innovation that we can deploy, we would not actually able to come to the full scale by 2030. It has to go beyond. And that to ensure that we have a continuity and also leading the organization to see this is a long-term change, and don't get too worried and hung up with if I can see a near-term result. And then net zero target actually from a business point of view help us to see this is the business case and this is the horizon that you're looking into. And that, of course, you shouldn't wait until 2050, but this is where you're heading. And so this, both the responsibility and opportunity part was really helping us to frame it. And I also think the business resilience part is also a very important role for us to play an important role in our strategy on how do we actually see why net zero is very important for us, because we wanted to stay ahead. And this transformation will help us to stay ahead, and a little bit more on actually the actual benefits on it as well. And then first short statement also on the risk assessment is, you can always discuss why should we do that, why should we do that, and then the cost of not doing it is also extremely high as well, especially for us as a company that we're a pump company, but if you're trying to categorize us, we are actually a technology-based problem-solving business. So a technology-based problem-solving business, if you're not keeping up, you would actually be eliminated. So for us, the cost of not keeping up, the cost of not acting on it to be resilient is also high and has an implication, so the strength of our future business as well. So that's how our business case look like.
Great, thank you so much. And really interesting to hear that B2B perspective and kind of remaining relevant, having that competitive advantage. And I'm sure, Simon, you share many of those elements, but obviously you're a B2C business, so slightly different stakeholders. It would be really interesting to hear from the Carlsberg perspective how you made the business case for net zero.
Well, sure, Pauline. And I think my first comment will be that there isn't a business case for net zero. If anyone has that, I think they will set up a consultancy and be very, very rich. I think for me, it's more about making a decision as a business, a decision as people who are working in that business. And for us at Carlsberg, of course, we were one of the first companies in the world to have a 1.5 degree aligned scenario or target in 2017. And back then, the discussion on the longer term vision, let's say, was a little bit less developed than it is today. And back then, basically, the decision we made was that we, as a brewer who is relying on a healthy ecosystem and on the natural resources that the planet is so good to give us, well, if that ecosystem is failing, we will not be able to sell beer. We will not have a viable business model. And given that, we have been around for 175 years, we would like to stay here for another 175 years. And with the trajectory that the world is on, well, then nobody is going to care about drinking beer in 100 years if we don't change this. And if I am to be a little bit more specific, I think any responsible business, they will look at risk and they will look at opportunity. And when we look at the risks, then of course there is potential disruptions to supply chain. There is changing consumption patterns of our products in a climate constrained world. There is regulation, there is cost drivers that is basically impossible for anyone to perfectly foresee. But here, an internal carbon price is a really good tool to start at least thinking in the long-term viability of your investments in a carbon constrained world. When I look at the opportunity side of a so-called business case, I think it's really about starting with the coalition of the willing. If you have specific customers like we do, if you have specific consumer groups that are more concerned, more interested, more engaged in the climate discussion, then start with them and then develop from there. Because having some successes, having some good cases, some wins, is incredibly important, both for your internal work on fighting climate change, but also in terms of the outside world. Show that you're actually doing something. It's not just back office talk and Excel sheets. It's something that actually hits the shelves, that is consumer facing. That is very, very important when you're a brand driven business like ours. So again, it's not rocket science. There isn't one business case, but any company should ask themselves, who do we want to be? That's the purpose part. They should look at the risks to their full value chain, to their business, and they should really look at what potential business opportunities are out there. Where can we really harvest some benefits of taking a real serious and strong stance on fighting climate change?
Great, thank you. And I think that leads really well into kind of the next area of, once you have set a target, what do you then actually do to kind of be in line to achieve it? And just to set the scene, I think, we've all seen certainly an increase in the past 12 months, a big focus on greenwashing, green hushing, and essentially the allegations that, well, many companies have net zero targets, but do they actually know what that means? Are they actually transforming their business in line with a net zero trajectory? So maybe back to you, Simon. You already started talking about this, but could you tell us a bit about how, once you set the targets, you kind of went about as a business to think, what do we need to do to actually get there? And maybe, a bit on some of the challenges, but also the wins that you kind of alluded to.
Mm-hmm. So when we started the journey in 2017, we did not have a net zero target. I actually don't think really the net zero methodology was even developed in 2017, if we really remember back. And where we started was to say we want to make our breweries carbon neutral by 2030, and then we want to reduce our value chain footprint with 30%. So back then, I can honestly say that we as a business, we were not ready to make a net zero commitment by 2040 in 2017. But during the course of our work on Scope 3 emissions, on identifying hotspots, and on really finding out how we can have a viable business in a climate constrained world, well, then the need for taking that next step, which was a net zero target in 2040, it was very, very clear to us. And the reason for that was that we started together with the Carbon Trust, by the way, in 2017, to harvest low-hanging fruits. And again, I think it's about what any responsible business should do. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we started with a very rudimentary efficiency plan. So how can we save energy in our own breweries in order to, you could say, finance the climate transition? So that is where we started. We then moved on to identifying the hotspots in our full value chain and understanding and knowing where we had the biggest emissions. And to us, it wasn't a gigantic surprise, but for example, packaging makes up more than 40% of our total value chain carbon footprint. To other businesses, it's more like 5 or 8. But because brewing and beer is generally a fairly low carbon product, so the liquid itself, then our packaging really made up a big part. So knowing that, having the information was absolutely key in order for us to then make decisions. So, when you look at what is, my advice to companies who want to start, well, start with low-hanging fruit, start with the parts that might actually save you some money, because that will then make it much, much easier to argue and discuss the financing of other activities that might require some more financing. And then secondly, start with data, start with information, start with really getting the facts in place. Because if you start off with, without facts or with bad data, then all of the decisions you make from there will actually not be right. So at least that was our starting point in 2017.
Great, thank you. And Geraldine, your Scope 3 footprint looks slightly different and indeed very challenging as well, because 99% of Grundfos's emissions come from the use phase. So maybe you could share a bit how you've kind of conceptualized tackling that and getting started there.
Yeah, I can. And then I can swear that Simon just speak half of my notes. So I'm just, without knowing anything, he has peek into my notes, even the wording was the same. But I definitely can speak into that. Yes, we look for a difference, of course, because we are selling pumps, and our pumps using electricity. And of course, so that makes our biggest emission is actually in our Scope 3 downstream emissions. However, I would say the actions that you need to do are not so much different from where you have to tackle the other area. You still, I very much agree with what Simon have just said, is you have to look into the data, and you actually have to spend a lot of time on your data. And do not watch, even though you would look to some low-hanging fruit very quickly, you really wanted to act on it, but there's nothing stop you from acting on it. But the big decisions, and actually to really develop the whole work on deployment on the decarbonization strategy, you need to spend a lot more time than you think on data, and actually go as far as you can and go as detailed as you can, and to actually identify where is, first of all, your hotspots, really where is the highest intensity on your emissions. And there you also would look if there's low-hanging fruit. But after you have done the really full analysis, you will figure out that maybe some of the low-hanging fruit, you can do something about it, but they ate your biggest problematic area, you can say. So you can actually design, and it also helps you to develop some short-term plan, and you can, using the low-hanging fruit to meet your near-term target perhaps, but you will still need to, at the same time, starting on some parallel work that is a more long-term, have a longer payback time, and has embracing a little bit more risk as well. So for us in our solution, and actually in an industry like water, and things takes time to change as well. That it actually means that we cannot just taking the low-hanging fruit in order to meet the long-term target. We actually have to start some of the really long-term changes already now in order to see the effect by 2030 or 2040. So this is something that we do. Also, because we have to deal with our customer, we are B2B business, and our emission is actually happening in their Scope 1 and 2. And that helps also to bring them on board. If they are on board also on SBTi, they also have their own target. They are motivated to reduce their Scope 1 and 2. And that's also where we actually can reduce our Scope 3 downstream. So it is not so much difference from other business working on Scope 3 upstream. We just have to do the same with our customers while maintaining the business. And one of the key things that we do, and actually is really one of the strongest tools that we do, is that we actually make our own Scope 1, 2, 3 emissions as our group level KPI. And of course, at the same time, we still define our business that we still need to grow. So basically, as a group, we have decided that we are going to continue to grow our business, but decoupling our emission growth from their point. And that it is a very bold move. And do we actually have all the answer to that? I can tell you, no, we don't have all the answer, but this is a decision. This is how we want to inspire the organization and make sure they understand that this is how we want to run our business in the future, is we want to grow our business that is decoupling with an emission growth. And this is the direction that we need to take. And this is, I would say, one of the strongest statements that we can actually bring to the organization to make sure all our colleagues is on board, and also to communicate to our external stakeholder that we mean this as a business. We don't mean it as just, a CSR or just greenwashing, because this is something we set as a company KPI. This is how we define our success now, if we can reduce our emissions.
Fantastic. That's really great to hear. And you touched on a point that actually overlaps with one of the questions that someone who registered sent in before the event. And that was, you've both spoken about the low-hanging fruits and that these can, quite well get you to that 2030 near-term target. But when we look at everything post-2030, as you mentioned, Geraldine, there are some unknowns, which I think most of our clients have experienced, as well as everyone else who has a net zero target. And really the kind of level of decarbonisation that's needed there. So, 90% across all value chain emissions by 2040, 2050. This is going to need some quite radical change and maybe even new business models. Could maybe, Simon, if we start with you, to kind of, how has Carlsberg started to think about that longer term, more radical and really deep decarbonisation?
So, in fact, you're touching upon some of the keywords from our most recent update to our sustainability program. Together Towards Zero was the name from 2017 until 2022. But in fact, in 2022, here in August, we added 2 more words called and beyond. So basically now it's called Together Towards Zero and beyond. And the and beyond part was actually primarily driven by the need for hashing out some of the hotspots in more detailed targets. And just to give you a concrete example, then, when we did the hotspot analysis in our full value chain, and we had 25% of our footprint from farming and from the agricultural sector, we had around 13% from brewing, we had 40% from packaging, we had around 13% from logistics, 9% from cooling. When we broke that down into each of the value chain steps, using real primary data for around 60% of all of the information and the emissions and the spend that we actually had in that, well, then we could see that it was no longer enough to have a general climate target to say, oh, we're going to go net zero, and then we're just going to fix it in the background. So 2 of the new targets and areas that we've singled out was in fact the agricultural area and the packaging area. So now if you go to carlsberggroup.com/ESG, well, basically here you will see that we have 2 brand new zeros to achieve zero farming footprint and zero packaging waste. And if I'm just focusing on one of these and how these are really transforming the long-term carbon impact of that area, well, you look at agriculture, it is an incredibly underdeveloped area within decarbonization. It is also an area that is very, very difficult to grasp. It is also an area where you need a lot of partnerships and cooperation to make change happen. So here we have set ourselves a target of moving to 30% of our agricultural products to come from regenerative practices by 2030, and 100% of our purchasing by 2040. And of course, the point here is that a true net zero target, which means for us that we will abate 90% and potentially offset, maximum of 10, well, then it is definitely not enough to just assume that we will find carbon negative or carbon neutral solutions in the agricultural supply chain without us stepping up, without us engaging with our suppliers and with the industry, with farmers, to develop low carbon growing solutions like no-low tilling, planting cover crops, having green fields basically year-round, cross-cropping, doing all of those things that we know have an effect, but that we now need to quantify. How much of an effect? What do we have to change? Does it change the way we purchase our grains in the future and our barley? What will the challenges be for the farmer on the ground who wants to convert to regenerative practices? So, that's an area where you have to start early. You have to accept that you don't know everything from the beginning. So basically we're saying we have a methodology on regenerative farming, but now we're going to develop it with our partners, with the supply chain, with the universities, with anyone who can help us. That is the only way to really achieve deep decarbonization within the agricultural area. And that's one example. And now I will stop talking, Pauline, to allow Geraldine to also say something.
Thank you. You touched on a really interesting point, which links to one of the audience questions that has actually just come through, which is on the importance of kind of external partnerships. You spoke about, engaging with your supply chain, even with universities and other technical partners. Geraldine, maybe you could share your experience there as well, or the vision that Grundfos has to kind of really work with a network of partners to achieve and work towards net zero.
Yeah, I think no doubt that actually, I think that's I would say this is actually one of the most exciting things about committing to net zero and having net zero target, to be honest, is all the innovations and also all the partnership that opens up to you, because now you're looking at things that is at a much longer horizon, which you don't actually bounce by the typical challenge that when you have a new innovations if you have tried to work with startup and entrepreneur, time is actually where most of the time what kills a business. How much time do I have a prototype, and then what do I see I have is my payback time, and all this. Basically, this is what the startup is struggling. So if you actually have a net zero target where you actually looking into something that is long term and is something that you accept is not going to see effect in the coming couple of years, and it opens up a lot of innovations, and actually you can nurture a lot more innovation as well. And I also think, even though you would think that we have a net zero target and latest by 2050, that sounds like a lot of time. But if you're actually looking into most of the entrepreneur new innovation, it takes 7 years from the idea into scale and mature the ideas in a real business environment. And so it is actually not a lot of times, and especially with the scale that we want to deploy, it is now that we have to start. And so I think it adds urgency if you're able to tell this information to people, but it's also extremely exciting because it is not boring. It is not just saying that, okay, now you have to take your responsibility. Now you have to, you have to take your vegetables and you have to drive your EV. Actually, now we're talking about let's do some transformation, which we actually have tried to do transformation for quite long and in many different industries. I don't think it's just in our business, and I think in many places, digitalization, transformations, everyone wanted to do that. And this is actually the best trigger, I think it's the best anchor point for you to do that. So I think this is exciting. And I think with the speed that we're talking about as well, it also opens up how much you embrace a partnership. And because you were not able to have all the answer on all the solutions, and you need to get inspired as well. So partnership is going to be one super important thing if you want to reach net zero, and if you actually wanted to reach a real net zero that actually would be able to stay, and that you are not creating your own fantasy that what will work, and you need to open up. So partnership, I think, in net zero is one of the most important things. And also a little bit touch up what Simon has touched upon, I think is important, is coming to net zero, especially from our lens in Grundfos, it is also talking about more collective actions. So it's not just the focus on the energy consumptions and how much emissions we can reduce, because as a company, I think we have the dilemma is we wanted to reduce emissions, we want to be more energy efficient. But at the same time, the world is actually walking into a water crisis. We are running out of water. We have to do more with water recycling. And so the lack of desalination, they actually use a lot more energy than the current process that we just extract groundwater from a well, and that doesn't take a lot of energy. And so we are actually having two problems at the same time. So we want to reduce our energy consumption, but we are moving into a world that is using a more energy-intensive water process. And I don't think this dilemma is alone to us. I'm pretty sure different industry has the similar dilemma, and is coming up is we are moving into a green transition that actually doesn't allow us to be green. And that requires a lot more collective actions that look beyond on just climate and emissions, but actually embeds into, other justice transitions. I think if you have been in the COP27, you hear all the collective action, including biodiversity, all related. So I think the collective actions that actually, in order to reach net zero, what is the sphere of influence that you have on your actions should also be part of your net zero goal and action as well. And therefore, I think the partnership is not just on technology partnership, but it's actually a collective partnership on other aspects of sustainability development as well.
That's really interesting. And I think, yeah, you bring up a really great point that it's not just about reducing your own emissions, but actually thinking ahead and, yeah, speculating what does the economy look like in 2030, 2040, 2050. I think even a company that doesn't act and doesn't set a net zero target will be operating in a world that is aligning to net zero. So what are the changes that we experience from, the climate change that we know is going to happen? What risks does that bring to my business? But also, what are the kind of, transition risks of the economy moving in that direction that I might not be able to anticipate or leverage if you don't set that net zero target, but also importantly think about the challenges of the future and how you're going to meet them. I think that's a really interesting area to explore. And I guess a bit more on the uncertainties and risks. A question has come into from the audience. Much of this is a bit unknown, particularly when we look at 2030, and we have models to kind of predict those risks and kind of we have a view of what technologies might enable net zero, but how do you kind of convince internally and externally your stakeholders that you are genuine about net zero, even if you don't, know all of the answers yet? How do you kind of make colleagues internally feel comfortable with your pledges, given there are unknowns, and then, communicating externally that even though you have unknowns, you're still on track to net zero? Maybe starting with Simon.
Well, so for us, it's really about showing the actions and showing the performance that you have done. When we look at our value chain footprinting, then basically we reduced our scope 3 emissions with 7% between 15 and 19 per produced hectoliter. So, we're showing that we are able to produce our beer in the full value chain, in the full 1, 2, and 3, with lower intensity. So my first point to anyone who challenges us on that would be, well, you can't go from 100% emissions to zero within a couple of years, right, in the full value chain. So the fact that we're on the right track, that our data shows it, that we have a very solid measurement, that we know our value chain, that we know our hotspots, and we have specific targets driving towards it, would, for me, be the proof that we're not just running around talking about fancy targets and then, not delivering on it. I do think that the discussion on what you said, green washing and green hushing and SDG washing and all of this, it's an incredibly important conversation to have, as long as it is a conversation. I know, for example, the science-based targets, they were under some criticism a year ago or so, and I think that's a good conversation that helps the science-based target improve. But in that conversation, I do not know of a concrete way to create specific targets for many different industries. I do not know of a better methodology than the science-based targets. And by the way, with any methodology or any difficult area, you have to accept that you keep learning, you keep developing it. And that would be my same answer to any people who like to ask, what about? I call that whataboutism, because when you look at a gigantic area like net zero decarbonization of a global company, then there will always be something you don't know. There will always be uncertainty. There will always be methodology that can be improved, or areas where you have not gone in the right direction, where you went in the opposite direction. But if you do not start, you will never get there. If you don't challenge status quo, you will not change the carbon intensive processes you have today. And really being fact-based, showing progress, being concrete, that is my way to counter any criticism or whataboutism. But at the same time, maintaining a humble approach and saying we don't know everything by far. And we need help. We need criticism also in order to improve. So I think that mix of pragmatism and concrete action and openness to learn, you can't live without it in the world of net zero.
Absolutely. Thank you. How about you, Geraldine? How have you tackled this internally and externally?
Yeah, I think I can only say I fully agree with what Simon has said. And first of all, if I tell you now that we have a plan to deliver our net zero and we know that we are on track, then it obviously would be a lie. Because I mean, a year ago we would not have known how the energy crisis unfold, and I do not know all the answer. And it is also, I also think that I also try to tell our colleagues, to be honest, to not worry so much that we don't have all the plan up until 2050, because if you have planned everything, you didn't leave room for transition to diverting risk, and you didn't leave room for innovations because you planned everything. And that means in your plan you have not planned to embrace any of that, and that, I would say, that is unrealistic to believe that you have a plan. It's unrealistic to actually expect any company to answer you that I am on track to my net zero. I would say net zero is a goal. Net zero is the guiding star. And I think I fully agree with what Simon said. Yes, what is more important is I can show you what is my plan in the coming years and what is my plan in actions, what I have planned to do and where I am investing in. And that is where I can prove to you I am moving toward to net zero. Whether or not I will get to net zero, I didn't plan to fail, but I cannot promise not to. But this is not in the plan that I will fail, right? But what I can only show to you is what I'm actually doing. So I also think that in a world as what we are, especially in sustainability, in climate, in ESG area, and if you do not plan to adapt and learn and explore more, and you would actually get into trouble. So if you want to lock into one methodology, one guidance, one setup, and one framework, and that you don't want to change in the next 5 to 10 years, you will run into a big problem, because this is probably one of the most dynamic area that changing requirements, and you have new regulation, you have new requirements, new methodology. A mistake is being found on a daily basis, and that if you don't embrace those and change and accept that what you have developed last year, that might be a fault that you couldn't foresee and you didn't see, and you have to change next year, you set up yourself to failure, and that's not a real failure. It's just what you perceive to be a problem. It is an area that evolving so much. So I think the most important things to do is to, when it comes to greenwashing, there's only one counter actions to that is a transparent communication. Is being data driven is fact. There's no magic around this. If the concern is greenwashing, this is the only answer: transparency and credible data and fact-based communication. That's the only way.
Thank you. So we're approaching the end of the panel. So I'm going to ask both of you to think about your kind of key top tip for someone who's starting out on this journey to set net zero targets and the implementation plans, and maybe something you wish you had known or your company had known before you started. While you think of that, I believe the poll results are ready, so we can have a quick look at where our audience is at on their journey to net zero. Okay, so that's really encouraging to see that actually the majority of the attendees are calculating baselines and targets, and many are also implementing. That's also fantastic to see. And we have a large commitment group as well, but there's still, a sizable portion that haven't started and still discussing internally. So I hope our panelists have shown you that this is very much something that you can move towards, that it's aspirational, that it's really going going to improve your business and then help it be resilient, competitive, and importantly, as was discussed as well, continue to grow in a net zero world. So with that, I will hand it over to Simon and then Geraldine to give us their kind of closing remarks.
I'm not going to give you one tip, Pauline. I'm going to give you three. Number one is our learning since, really having engaged in this since 2015-16 and launching our science-based targets in 17 is to get started, lean in, start collecting the data, do the measurements. It's okay that you're not perfect from the beginning, but you have to get started. And when you do that, make sure it's a cross-functional project internally. And by the way, I highly recommend getting some external experts to help you. That helps both on the outside-in perspective. It also helps on sometimes getting some muscle into the project team, some man hours, and some really skilled knowledge to help you get started on the first point. So really, number one is lean in there and start measuring and understanding your full value chain footprint. And number two is for me, it's very important to focus on primary data. I know that there's a lot of companies out there that is looking at economic input-output models and secondary data. I personally don't think that's the right way to go. I know that primary data is much more difficult. It's much more tedious, but the benefit you get is that you can actually see your real purchased goods in your value chain footprint. We have 36 different companies that operate as different entities. And the only way that we can keep real engagement internally is that our company in Vietnam can see their specific footprint from their specific suppliers. If you only use secondary data, this is not possible. And the third recommendation is to be humble and engage your supply chain on an explorative basis. Your suppliers, they know their products quite well. And I spoke about the coalition of the willing earlier. We had some suppliers like within aluminium, ball, or OI within glass, who were really ready to engage in this conversation and who are also themselves now having really, really ambitious carbon targets. So engage the value chain, be humble, learn from their experience, and find solutions together on how to truly decarbonize your entire value chain. So those would be the three pieces of advice from my side.
Great, thank you. And Geraldine, if you have three, you can do that as well.
Yes, I hope that next time when we go to buy beer, we also buy one, get free. But I think I have two. First of all, I think for a company, if you are really just started, I think it really helps. I think for us in Grundfos, it helps that you start to treat carbon emissions or GHG emission actually as a currency in your data collections process. I think, first of all, the process of integrating it together with the finance team and have the data collection process similar to the finance system and start to collecting all this information, just like our finance data. It has been a big help. It is one of the most transformational steps that we have, and it improves the quality and it also help our colleagues to understand on why do we need this level of accuracy. It is not just some assumption data is good enough, but because they are used to the finance system, they know when it comes to finance data, it has to be accurate, it has to be fact-based. And it actually helps to translate a lot of this, explaining a lot of the requirements that we need also in the ESG data. By doing so. So I think this is actually one of the good steps if you have not already started doing this and work closer with your finance team and actually streamline the process on your data collection. I think that has been one of the really, really important steps we have done in Grundfos. And second is, I think it's actually a little bit what Simon has said in the previous questions. I think embracing some of the paradox and the what if. Because sometimes if you are too worried about what you don't know and therefore you don't do anything, then you guarantee it will not happen. And it is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in this case. If you don't act, then of course it won't happen. And I think this also depends on what company you are in. I think company like Grundfos and Carlsberg, where we are in our industry, We have a leader positions. And if we don't add, of course, we were not able to drive the industry to do that as well. And that is very important that you add, or else the changes that you want to see will not happen. And of course, I would say, as I explained our business as well, that there is a paradox, there is a challenge, it is a dilemma. The factors are actually disagreeing with each other. How could I sell more, pump more water and using less energy, have less emissions? It doesn't make sense. And I would say a mini episode of this kind of a paradox in situations where we almost wanted to tell ourselves, this is not happening. And it also happens. I would not tell you it not happens and everything was a rose and garden and just go very smooth. It is not true. It is all this happens. Everyone has doubt in this, and everyone will doubt at any given moment. I think what you have to keep in mind is we must embrace there are something we don't know, and embrace those what if and those paradox that happens to you, and actually make sure that you set out your goal of what kind of change that you want to do and focus on the change that you wanted to achieve, or else that changes will not happen. I think embracing that with uncertainty is very, very important if you want to move toward net zero.
Great, thank you, and really thank you both for your candid responses on this panel. I think the more companies and individuals open up about their journey and make it realistic is ultimately what's going to help us all work together and work towards that common goal. So thank you very much, and thank you for the audience for your really interesting questions. I hope you really enjoyed the discussion, and yeah, on to the next panel. Thanks everyone.